What medical emergency did your family ignore that almost killed you? The surgeon looked me straight in the eyes and said, 1 more hour, and you would have died. My appendix had already burst by the time they cut me open. The poison was spreading through my entire abdomen while my family spent 6 hours telling me I was faking to get out of eating vegetables. It started during Thanksgiving dinner when I was 12. We were at Dad's house because of the custody arrangement. Mom had left 8 months earlier after finding his text messages with other women. The temporary custody order meant Alice and I alternated holidays between parents, and this particular Thursday was Dad's turn. The dining room table was set with Grandma's good china, the kind that only came out for holidays and special occasions. Dad was carving the turkey with surgical precision, while Uncle Jerome dominated the conversation about Michigan's terrible football season. Aunt Catherine kept refilling wine glasses and making passive-aggressive comments about how nice it was to have the whole family together again. The pain started as a small twinge in my lower right abdomen during grace. Uncle Jerome was thanking God for family unity and Dad's successful construction business when something sharp twisted inside me. I shifted in my chair, trying to find a position where it didn't hurt. "Mason, sit still," Grandma said without looking up from her perfectly arranged plate. She was wearing her holiday pearls and the floral dress she'd had for 15 years. "Show some respect during the blessing." When the green bean casserole reached me, I took a small portion and pushed it around my plate. The smell made my stomach lurch. The pain was getting more focused now, like someone was poking me from the inside with a hot knife. "Finish your vegetables," Dad said, his voice carrying that warning tone I knew too well. "Don't embarrass me. Don't be difficult. Don't be like your mother." I took one tiny bite and immediately felt nauseated. "I can't. My stomach really hurts." The words came out quieter than I intended, almost a whisper. Uncle Jerome stopped mid-sentence about the Lions quarterback controversy to stare at me. "Stomachache? On Thanksgiving? That's awfully convenient, don't you think?" Aunt Catherine let out a sharp laugh. "He's been pulling this act since he was 5 years old. Anytime there's something he doesn't want to do, suddenly he's deathly ill." The other adults nodded knowingly, while Alice watched me with worried eyes. Alice knew I wasn't a complainer. She'd seen me play basketball with a sprained wrist because I didn't want to let my team down. She'd watched me finish a science project with a fever because the deadline couldn't wait. "You will sit there until every bite is gone," Dad said, finally looking directly at me. His face was flushed from wine, and I could see that familiar anger building behind his eyes, the same expression he'd worn during all those fights with Mom before she finally left. The pain was spreading now, radiating from that sharp point in my side across my entire abdomen. I tried to sit up straighter, but movement made everything worse. Sweat was beading on my forehead despite the house being cold from November wind rattling the windows. "Dad, I think Mason's really sick," Alice said quietly, reaching over to squeeze my hand under the table. Her small fingers felt warm against my clammy palm. "He looks really pale." "Your brother is manipulative," Grandma said, cutting her turkey into precise little squares. "Just like his mother. Give children an inch and they'll take a mile. Next thing you know, he'll be demanding to call Rebecca to come rescue him." The mention of Mom's name made Dad's jaw clench. Mom had endured 7 years of this family's hostility, their passive-aggressive comments and outright cruelty. They blamed her for making Dad soft, for introducing concepts like communication and therapy instead of discipline and obedience. "Mason stays exactly where he is," Dad said firmly. "Rebecca doesn't get to swoop in every time life gets uncomfortable. He needs to learn to push through adversity instead of looking for the easy way out." The pain was constant now, getting worse by the minute. I couldn't find any position that helped. Leaning forward felt like being stabbed. Sitting back made the pain radiate up into my chest. "Please," I whispered. "Something's really wrong. I think I need a doctor." The table fell completely silent. Then Uncle Jerome burst into laughter. "A doctor? For a stomachache? Jesus Christ, Robert, what kind of kids are you raising?" "The dramatic kind, apparently," Dad replied coldly. "The kind who think the world revolves around their every discomfort." Aunt Catherine jumped in with a story about her son Tommy trying to fake appendicitis to avoid a math test in high school. "Cost us 3 doctor visits and hundreds in copays before we figured out he was lying. These kids have no shame anymore." I wanted to scream that this wasn't like that I'd never faked illness in my entire life. But the pain was making it hard to think clearly. Everything felt foggy around the edges, and nausea was building in waves. "I need to use the bathroom," I said, starting to stand. The movement sent fresh agony shooting through my side, and I had to grab the table edge to keep from falling. "Sit back down," Grandma commanded sharply. "You'll finish every bite on that plate before you move from this table. Your father worked hard to provide this meal." "But I'm going to throw up," I gasped, doubling over as another wave of pain hit. "Then you'll clean it up and still finish your dinner," Dad said, without an ounce of sympathy. "I'm tired of these performances, Mason. We all are." Alice stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I'm calling Mom," she announced, pulling her phone from her pocket. Dad's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "You are not calling anyone. Rebecca has no business interfering with our holiday. Sit down and finish eating." "Let go of me," Alice said, trying to pull free. "Mason needs help." "Alice Marie, you sit down this instant," Grandma said in her most authoritative voice. Children do not make medical decisions in this family. Adults do. The pain was becoming unbearable. I couldn't sit still anymore. I kept shifting, trying to find relief, but nothing helped. My skin felt hot and clammy at the same time. The room was starting to spin slightly. "Look at him," Alice said, her voice getting higher. "He's sweating and shaking. Something's really wrong. What's wrong is that he's learned to manipulate people with fake tears and dramatics," Uncle Jerome said dismissively. "My ex-wife used to pull the same stunts, always sick whenever there was work to be done or responsibilities to face." I tried to take another bite of turkey, hoping to appease them enough to let me leave the table. But the moment the food touched my tongue, my stomach rebelled. I clapped my hand over my mouth, fighting not to vomit right there on Grandma's good china. "Don't you dare," Dad warned, pointing his fork at me. "Don't you dare throw up at this table." I stumbled toward the kitchen, hand still pressed to my mouth, vision blurring from the pain. Behind me, I could hear Dad's chair scraping back, his footsteps following. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded as I lurched toward the sink. I couldn't answer because I was actively trying not to vomit. The pain in my side was so intense now that I was seeing spots. I gripped the counter edge with my free hand, knuckles white. "Answer me when I'm talking to you," Dad said, grabbing my shoulder and spinning me around to face him. The movement was too much. My stomach convulsed, and I threw up all over the kitchen floor, missing the sink completely. The vomit was mostly liquid, bile mixed with the small amount of food I'd managed to choke down. "God damn it, Mason!" Dad exploded, his face turning red. "Look what you've done! You've ruined Thanksgiving for everyone!" I couldn't help it, I gasped, still doubled over. The pain was radiating from my right side up into my shoulder now. "Please, Dad. Something's really wrong. I need to go to the hospital. What you need is to clean this mess up and stop acting like a spoiled brat," he said, grabbing a roll of paper towels and throwing them at my feet. "Clean it up, now." I tried to bend down to pick up the paper towels, but the pain was so intense that I couldn't straighten back up. I stayed hunched over, one hand pressed against my side, breathing in short gasps. Alice appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale with worry. "Dad, please, look at him. He can barely stand up." "He can stand up just fine when he wants to," Dad said coldly. "This is all an act to get attention and sympathy. I've seen it 100 times. But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. I wasn't just pale anymore. My lips were turning slightly blue, and sweat was pouring down my face despite the chills that were making me shake. "I'm calling 911, Alice said, pulling out her phone again. This time Dad didn't just grab her wrist. He knocked the phone out of her hands, and it skittered across the kitchen floor, spinning under the refrigerator. "No one is calling anyone," he said firmly. "Mason will go upstairs and lie down until he feels better. This family does not need to waste emergency resources on a stomachache." Alice looked at him like she didn't recognize him. "What if it's not just a stomachache? What if it's something serious? Then he'll get over it," Grandma said, appearing in the doorway. She looked at the vomit on her kitchen floor with disgust. "Children have been surviving stomach bugs for thousands of years without running to the hospital every time." I tried to stand up straight, but another wave of pain knocked me back down. This time, I couldn't suppress the moan that escaped. The sound was involuntary, primal, unlike anything I'd ever made before. "Enough," Dad said, grabbing my arm and hauling me toward the stairs. "You're going to your room to think about how you've ruined everyone's holiday with this performance." Each step up the stairs was agony. By the time we reached my bedroom, I was barely conscious. Dad practically threw me onto the bed and slammed the door behind him. I could hear him turning the lock from the outside. I lay there in the dark, curled in a ball, trying to find any position that didn't make the pain worse, but it was spreading now, no longer confined to that one spot in my side. My entire abdomen felt like it was on fire. Hours passed. I could hear the family downstairs, continuing their Thanksgiving celebration like nothing had happened. Uncle Jerome's booming laugh, Aunt Catherine's shrill commentary about some neighbor's divorce, the clink of dishes being cleared and dessert being served. Alice knocked on the door twice, trying to check on me, but Dad's voice quickly called her away both times. "Leave your brother alone. He needs to learn that actions have consequences." The pain kept getting worse. I started timing the waves, hoping to find some pattern, some relief. But there was no relief, just constant, escalating agony that made it hard to think about anything else. Around 8 o'clock, I heard Alice arguing with someone downstairs. Her voice was getting louder, more desperate. "He's been up there for hours. What if something's really wrong?" "Nothing is wrong except his attitude," Dad replied. "He'll come down when he's ready to apologize and finish his dinner." But I wasn't getting better. I was getting worse. Much worse. The nausea was constant now, and I'd thrown up twice more into the wastebasket beside my bed. My fever was climbing, making everything feel dreamlike and disconnected. By 9 o'clock, I couldn't stay in bed anymore. The pain was so intense that lying still felt impossible. I paced around my small room, bent over, trying to walk off the agony. But movement made everything worse. I tried to call out for help, but my voice was barely a whisper. The fever was making my throat dry and scratchy. When I managed to make any sound at all, it was just weak moaning that no one downstairs could hear over their continued celebration. Alice must have been listening, though, because around 10 o'clock I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She tried the door handle and found it locked. Mason? She whispered. Are you okay? I wanted to answer, but I was too weak. I'd been fighting this pain for 8 hours now, and my body was starting to shut down. I managed to knock weakly on the door, hoping she'd understand. I'm going to get help, she whispered. Hold on. But a few minutes later, I heard Dad's heavy footsteps on the stairs. Alice, what are you doing up here? I told you to leave your brother alone. He needs a doctor, Dad. He's been sick for hours. He's been dramatic for hours, Dad corrected. There's a difference. Now go brush your teeth and get ready for bed. But now, Alice. I heard her reluctant footsteps moving away, and then Dad was gone too. The house grew quiet as everyone prepared for bed, satisfied that they'd successfully weathered my latest attention-seeking episode. But I wasn't seeking attention anymore. I was dying. The realization hit me around midnight when the pain suddenly shifted. Instead of the sharp, focused agony I'd been experiencing, everything went numb and cold. My fever broke in a rush of sweat. But instead of feeling better, I felt infinitely worse. I knew enough from health class to recognize that this wasn't improvement. This was my body giving up the fight. Whatever was happening inside me had won. I tried to get up to bang on the door, to scream for help, but I couldn't coordinate my movements anymore. My legs wouldn't support my weight. When I tried to call out, only a weak croak emerged. I crawled to the door and managed to knock once, weakly, before collapsing on the floor. The hardwood was cold against my fevered skin, and I found myself thinking about Mom, how she would have taken one look at me hours ago and driven straight to the emergency room, regardless of what anyone else thought. Alice must have been waiting and listening, because within minutes I heard her creeping up the stairs again. This time she had something with her, metal tools that clinked softly as she worked on the door lock. I'm coming, Mason, she whispered. I'm going to get you help. The lock clicked open, and suddenly Alice was kneeling beside me on the floor. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see her face go white with shock. Oh my God, she breathed. Mason, what's happening to you? I tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. Can't move. Alice disappeared for a moment and came back with her phone. She'd retrieved it from under the refrigerator while everyone was watching football in the living room. Her fingers shook as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? My brother is really sick, Alice said, trying to keep her voice low. He's been throwing up for hours and now he can't stand up. I think he's dying. How old is your brother, sweetheart? 12. And he's been in pain all day. But my family said he was faking. What's your address? Alice gave them Dad's address, her voice getting steadier as she focused on helping me. The dispatcher asked more questions about my symptoms, and Alice answered as best she could. An ambulance is on the way, the dispatcher said. Stay on the line with me. Is your brother conscious? Barely, Alice said, kneeling down to touch my forehead. He's really hot and sweaty. That's when we heard Dad's footsteps on the stairs, moving fast. Alice quickly ended the call and shoved the phone under my bed just as he appeared in the doorway. What the hell is going on up here? He demanded, taking in the scene. Me collapsed on the floor, Alice kneeling beside me, the door unlocked. He collapsed, Alice said simply. Look at him, Dad. Really look at him. For the first time all day, Dad actually looked at me, saw my gray skin, my blue lips, the way I was shaking uncontrollably on the floor. I watched his expression change from anger to confusion to something that might have been fear. Mason, he said, his voice different now. Can you hear me? I managed to nod slightly, but I couldn't speak. Everything felt disconnected, like I was watching this happen to someone else. Dad knelt down and put his hand on my forehead. Jesus Christ, he's burning up. He looked at Alice with something approaching panic. How long has he been like this? All day, Alice said quietly. I tried to tell you. That's when we heard the sirens in the distance getting closer. Dad's head snapped up. Did you call an ambulance? Alice lifted her chin defiantly. Yes. Alice, what have you done? Dad said, running his hands through his hair. Do you have any idea how expensive? The sirens were in our driveway now. Red and blue lights flashed across my bedroom walls. Heavy footsteps ran up the front walkway, and someone was pounding on the door. Go let them in, Alice told Dad firmly. Now. Dad hesitated for a moment, looking between me and the noise downstairs. The rest of the family was awake now, voices raised in confusion about why there were paramedics at the door. Go, Alice repeated. He needs help. Dad finally went downstairs, and within minutes paramedics were in my room. 2 men with gentle hands and professional voices, asking Alice questions about my symptoms while they took my vital signs. When did the pain start? One of them asked, while the other prepared an IV. During dinner, Alice said. Around 4 o'clock. It got worse and worse, but everyone said he was faking. The paramedic looked at his partner with the expression I couldn't read. 12-year-old male, severe abdominal pain for 8 hours, high fever, signs of shock. We need to move fast. They lifted me onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency. I could hear Dad arguing with someone downstairs about whether this was really necessary, whether they could just take me to an urgent care clinic instead of the emergency room. Sir, your son needs immediate medical attention, one of the paramedics said firmly. This isn't a discussion. Alice rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand while the paramedic worked. She looked so small in the back of that ambulance, but her grip was steady and sure. You're going to be okay, she kept saying. The doctors are going to fix you. but I could see the worry in the paramedic's face as he monitored my blood pressure. I could hear him radioing ahead to the hospital, using medical terms that sounded serious and urgent. At the emergency room, everything moved quickly. Bright lights, people in scrubs, machines beeping. A doctor appeared and started examining me while asking rapid-fire questions about my symptoms. "Abdominal pain for 8 hours?" she said, pressing on my stomach. I screamed when she touched the right side. "No medical attention until now?" Alice explained what had happened while nurses drew blood and started fluids through my IV. The doctor's expression grew increasingly grim as she heard the timeline. "We need a CT scan immediately," she told the nurses, "and call surgery. This looks like appendicitis, and given the time frame, we might be looking at rupture." Dad arrived just as they were wheeling me toward radiology. He looked haggard and confused, like he couldn't quite process what was happening. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked the doctor. She looked at him with barely concealed disgust. "We'll know more after the scan, but 8 hours is a very long time to ignore symptoms this severe." The CT scan showed exactly what the doctor had suspected. My appendix hadn't just ruptured. It had been leaking poison into my abdomen for hours, causing a massive infection called peritonitis. "We need to operate immediately," the surgeon explained to Dad, while nurses prepped me for surgery. "The infection has spread throughout his abdominal cavity. Every minute we delay increases the risk." I watched Dad's face crumble as the reality hit him. This wasn't manipulation or attention-seeking. This was a genuine medical emergency that could have killed me. "How close?" he started to ask, then stopped. "Another hour and we would have lost him," the surgeon said bluntly. "Peritonitis is often fatal if not treated quickly." They put me under anesthesia before I could see Dad's reaction to that news. The last thing I remembered was Alice squeezing my hand and promising she'd be there when I woke up. The surgery took 3 hours. They had to remove my ruptured appendix and clean out all the infected tissue from my abdomen. The surgeon later told Mom, who arrived from out of state just as I was being moved to recovery, that it was one of the worst cases of peritonitis she'd seen in a child. I spent 6 days in the hospital. The infection had been so severe that I needed strong antibiotics through an IV for the entire stay. Alice visited every day after school, bringing homework and updates from friends who'd heard about my emergency surgery. Dad visited too, but he looked different now, smaller somehow. He couldn't meet my eyes when he apologized, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have believed you," he said on the 3rd day. "I should have listened." But the apology felt hollow after everything that had happened. After 8 hours of dismissing my pain as manipulation. After locking me in my room to suffer alone. After preventing Alice from getting help. Mom arrived with a lawyer. Child Protective Services had been notified by the hospital about the delay in medical treatment. They wanted to interview everyone about what had happened, why a 12-year-old with obvious signs of appendicitis had been denied medical care for 8 hours. The social worker, a kind woman named Linda, spoke with Alice first. Alice told the truth about everything, how I'd been in obvious pain since dinner, how the adults had dismissed my symptoms as attention-seeking, how Dad had locked me in my room, how she'd had to sneak upstairs to unlock the door and call 911 herself. When Linda interviewed me, I was still weak from the surgery, but I managed to tell her everything too, how I'd begged for help, how they'd accused me of ruining Thanksgiving, how I'd been left alone to suffer while they continued their celebration downstairs. "Did anyone try to take your temperature or examine you in any way?" Linda asked. "No," I said quietly. "They didn't want to encourage my performance." Linda wrote everything down in her notebook, her expression growing more serious with each detail. The interview with Dad was different. He tried to explain how I'd had a history of complaining about vegetables, how the family had been dealing with stress from the divorce, how they'd made an error in judgment. "An error in judgment?" Linda repeated. "Your son was experiencing symptoms of a life-threatening condition for 8 hours. At what point did you consider that he might actually be sick?" Dad couldn't answer that question. The investigation took 2 weeks. During that time, Alice and I stayed with Mom at her apartment. The temporary custody order was modified to reflect the new circumstances. Dad was required to attend parenting classes and family counseling before he could have unsupervised visits again. Grandma never apologized. Neither did Uncle Jerome or Aunt Catherine. They maintained that they'd made reasonable assumptions based on past behavior and that the outcome was an unfortunate coincidence. But Alice had recorded part of the Thanksgiving dinner conversation on her phone before Dad confiscated it. In her statement to CPS, she provided a timeline that showed how consistently the adults had dismissed clear signs of a medical emergency. The case was eventually closed with a finding of medical neglect. Dad's custody was reduced to supervised visits only. Mom was granted primary custody of both Alice and me. I returned to school 6 weeks later with a long scar across my abdomen and a different perspective on family loyalty. My friends asked what had happened, and I told them the simple version. I'd had emergency surgery for appendicitis over Thanksgiving break, but Alice told the real story to her best friend, who told her parents, who mentioned it to other families in our community. Word spread quietly through the parent network about what had really happened. How a 12-year-old had nearly died because the adults in his life refused to take his pain seriously. Some people were horrified. Others defended Dad's family, saying that children do fake illnesses sometimes, and how were they supposed to know this time was different? But the parents who'd rushed their own kids to urgent care for stomach bugs, who'd worried through every fever and cough, they understood. They knew the difference between caution and neglect. Dr. Patterson, the surgeon who'd saved my life, wrote a detailed report for the court case. She documented exactly how close I'd come to dying, how the delay in treatment had turned a routine appendectomy into a life-threatening emergency. In 20 years of practice, she wrote, I have rarely seen a case where parental denial so directly endangered a child's life. The symptoms Mason displayed were textbook indicators of appendicitis. Any reasonable adult should have sought medical attention within the first hour. That report became part of my permanent medical record, evidence of what happens when adults choose pride over protection. 6 months later, Dad completed his court-mandated programs and requested expanded visitation. The family court judge reviewed all the evidence, the medical records, the CPS investigation, Alice's testimony, the recordings. Mr. Foster, she said, your son nearly died because you and your family chose to ignore clear signs of a medical emergency. You prioritized your authority over his welfare. While I'm willing to allow supervised visits to resume, I want to be very clear. Mason's physical and emotional safety will always take precedence over your parental rights. Dad nodded and accepted the restricted custody arrangement, but the relationship between us never fully recovered. Trust, once broken that completely, doesn't just heal with time and apologies. Alice and I both kept detailed journals about our experiences, at the suggestion of our therapist. Writing helped us process what had happened and recognize the patterns we needed to avoid in our own lives. Years later, when Alice was applying to medical school, she wrote her entrance essay about that Thanksgiving night, about being 10 years old and having to choose between adult authority and her brother's life, about learning to trust her own judgment even when everyone around her insisted she was wrong. She became a pediatric emergency room physician. I chose a different path, but the experience shaped me just as profoundly. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones most likely to dismiss your pain. That family loyalty can be used as a weapon to silence victims. That speaking up for yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. The scar on my abdomen faded over time, but I never forgot the lesson it represented. When someone tells you they're in pain, believe them. When a child asks for help, listen. When your gut says something is wrong, act. Because sometimes you're the only person standing between someone and tragedy. Sometimes you're the difference between life and death. And sometimes being right means being willing to bite your grandmother's wrist and call 911 anyway.